It started with a smirk and 3 words that echoed like arrogance personified. "I'll sue you," a phrase tossed around by people who think they understand power. But in this courtroom, those words mean war. Across the aisle sat an experienced female judge, her silver hair framed by the sharp glow of courtroom lights, eyes steady as steel. She had heard those words 1,000 times before, from the entitled, the overconfident, and the self-righteous. But this time it was different. This time the man saying them wasn't just bluffing. He believed he was untouchable. His name was Brandon Hale, a flashy entrepreneur who thought money could outtalk the truth. He was suing his former assistant, a quiet woman named Kayla, for defamation and damages after she exposed his lies online. Cameras rolled. The crowd leaned forward. He leaned back smug, convinced that his polished suit and expensive lawyer could do the talking. But then, the judge spoke. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried that unmistakable authority that slices through pretense like glass through silk. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I hope you understand that in my courtroom, ego holds no value. Only facts do," he chuckled under his breath. But what happened next would turn that smirk into silence and expose a truth that not even his wealth could bury. Because when arrogance meets evidence, the law always wins. The morning sun crept through the narrow slats of the courtroom blinds, slicing the air into golden stripes. The faint hum of chatter filled the room as reporters jostled for camera positions, murmuring about the man who was about to take the stand. Brandon Hale, the self-made millionaire, tech visionary, and self-proclaimed image of modern success. He was dressed like he knew the cameras loved him, a tailored navy suit, Rolex flashing under the fluorescent light, and that trademark half smile, the kind that said, "I've already won." He adjusted his tie, glanced at his reflection in the polished courtroom window, and exhaled slowly. Across the aisle sat Kayla Brooks, a small-town woman in a modest beige blouse, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked tired but not defeated. She wasn't there to win fame or fortune. She was there because of something far simpler: the truth. Brandon had fired her 6 months ago. He claimed she breached confidentiality. She claimed he broke something much bigger: the law. And when she refused to stay silent, when she posted her story online, his empire of influence turned on her like a machine. Within weeks, she'd lost her job, her apartment, and almost her faith in justice. But today, sitting in the presence of an experienced female judge, silver-haired and calm like a storm waiting to break, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. The arrival Brandon's entourage filled the first row: assistants, publicists, and a PR specialist who looked more nervous than he did. As he walked to the plaintiff's table, the crowd's low murmurs grew louder. "Mr. Hale, how do you feel about this case?" someone shouted. He smirked. "Confident," he replied smoothly. "When the truth's on your side, there's nothing to fear." But those words, so rehearsed, so hollow, rang differently under the fluorescent hum of justice. The court clerk motioned for everyone to rise. All rise. The Honorable Judge Evelyn Marks presiding. The door opened and silence followed. Judge Marks entered, her presence commanding without effort. She had the kind of authority that wasn't spoken but felt. Decades of courtroom experience woven into every step. She took her seat, scanned the courtroom once, and then looked directly at Brandon. He met her gaze for a split second before glancing away. That was the first crack. The opening exchange. "Mr. Hale," she began, her voice calm but sharp, "you are bringing forth a civil suit claiming defamation and damages totaling $100,000 against Ms. Brooks, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Brandon replied, sitting straighter. "She made false statements about me that have harmed my reputation and my business." "And Ms. Brooks," the judge turned to the defendant, "you are representing yourself?" Kayla nodded nervously. "Yes, Your Honor, I can't afford a lawyer." Judge Marks regarded her kindly. "You understand that you're responsible for presenting your own defense?" "Yes, ma'am. I do," Brandon smirked slightly. His attorney leaned over, whispering something that made him chuckle under his breath. The judge's gaze flicked back to him. "Something amusing, Mr. Hale?" He straightened instantly. "No, Your Honor." "Good," she said dryly. "Because this courtroom isn't a stage. It's where we separate story from fact. Please remember that." The smirk faded. The audience exchanged quiet looks. The backstory, as the case began. Brandon's lawyer painted him as a hardworking entrepreneur whose reputation had been unjustly attacked by a disgruntled former employee. The lawyer's voice dripped with practiced confidence. She accused my client of exploiting his workers and falsifying documents, accusations that are entirely false and have caused irreparable damage to his image and his brand, he declared. The judge nodded patiently. And your evidence? The lawyer handed over a stack of documents. We have screenshots, Your Honor, social media posts where Ms. Brooks made slanderous statements against Mr. Hale. The clerk passed the pages up. Judge Marks adjusted her glasses, reading quietly for a moment. I see. And Ms. Brooks, she said, turning to Kayla, do you deny making these posts? Kayla swallowed. No, Your Honor. I wrote them. Brandon leaned back, crossing his arms smugly. But, she continued, everything I said was true. The courtroom buzzed. Brandon's lawyer rose immediately. Objection. She's making statements without evidence. Overruled, said Judge Marks. She's simply responding. Continue, Ms. Brooks. Kayla looked down, then back up with trembling determination. I worked for Mr. Hale for almost 2 years. He made us sign non-disclosure agreements so tight we couldn't even talk about our working conditions. When he started cutting pay and threatening people who spoke up, I knew someone had to tell the truth. I posted what I saw, the falsified expense reports, the unpaid overtime. I didn't lie, Your Honor. I told the truth. Brandon's jaw tightened. His lawyer whispered again. Mr. Hale, Judge Mark said, glancing at him, you'll have your turn to respond. Cracks in the armor as testimony continued. Brandon tried to maintain his polished demeanor. He smiled at the jury, nodded politely, spoke with that rehearsed humility that made him sound like a victim, but Judge Marks wasn't buying it when Kayla presented an old email thread, showing how Brandon had directed her to adjust financial records. His confidence flickered. Ms. Brooks, the judge asked, is this your email? Yes, Your Honor. And that's his response below. Brandon's lawyer quickly objected. Your Honor, this evidence is out of context. Sit down, the judge interrupted firmly. Context can be explained. Evidence cannot be ignored. The room went quiet. Brandon's face reddened. As the hours passed, his frustration began to show. Every time Kayla spoke, he shifted, sighed, or whispered sharply to his attorney. Finally, the judge had enough. Mr. Hale, she said, her tone colder now, if you interrupt this court one more time, I will have you removed. Understood? He forced a smile. Understood, Your Honor, but his eyes burned with resentment. The persona unravels. During cross-examination, Brandon's lawyer tried to paint Kayla as an unstable ex-employee seeking attention. You were fired, correct? He asked. Yes. And you were upset about that? Of course. But that doesn't make me a liar. So you admit you had a motive to harm my client? I had a motive to tell the truth, she said quietly. Judge Marks leaned forward slightly, studying her. There was no anger in Kayla's voice, only fatigue. The kind that comes from months of being dismissed and doubted. Mr. Hale, the judge said suddenly, how many employees did you terminate in the last year? He blinked. About 10, maybe 12. And how many of them signed similar agreements to Ms. Brooks? All of them. Interesting, she said. It seems you have quite a pattern of disgruntled employees. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Kayla didn't gloat. She just sat quietly, watching as the weight of the truth began pressing against his arrogance. The moment of hubris by the afternoon, the courtroom felt heavier. The tension was thick, the crowd restless. The judge called a short recess, but Brandon wasn't done performing. As people stood and stretched, a reporter near the back shouted, Mr. Hale, care to comment? Brandon smirked. Yeah, this is what happens when people forget who's really in control. The words hung in the air like a spark near gasoline. When the recess ended, Judge Marks returned, her expression unreadable. Mr. Hale, she said evenly, did you make a statement to the media during this recess? He froze. I might have answered a question. You are aware that discussing an active case publicly during proceedings can be considered contempt? His lawyer jumped in. Your Honor, it was a harmless comment. Not in my courtroom, she said sharply. Mr. Hale, if you wish to play by your own rules, you may do so elsewhere. But in here, you play by mine. Brandon's composure cracked. For the first time, he looked small. Kayla's strength. When it was her turn to close for the day, Kayla didn't have notes or a lawyer's vocabulary. She just spoke. "I'm not here for revenge," she said softly. "I'm here because people like me, people without power, deserve to be heard. I worked hard. I kept my head down. And when I finally spoke up, I lost everything. But at least I have my honesty. That's something Mr. Hale can't buy." Even Brandon's lawyer fell silent. The courtroom did too. Judge Marks nodded slowly. "Court will resume tomorrow morning," she said. "Until then, I suggest both parties remember that truth is the only currency that matters here." Brandon didn't look up. His jaw was tight. His hands trembled slightly as he gathered his papers. Kayla stood, her shoulders squared, the faintest smile touching her lips. For the first time in months, she didn't feel powerless. She felt free. The next morning, the courthouse steps buzzed with the electric hum of media chaos. Reporters lined up shoulder to shoulder, microphones and cameras trained on the double doors like soldiers awaiting orders. Brandon Hale arrived in a charcoal gray suit and designer sunglasses, flanked by his lawyer and a pair of publicists. His smile was practiced, the kind that could light up a billboard. But behind it, there was something else now. Tension. Kayla Brooks entered quietly through a side door. She wasn't used to flashbulbs, and she certainly wasn't used to being a headline. But overnight, she had become one. Millionaire tech CEO battles former employee in explosive defamation trial. Her face, captured mid-blink, was plastered beside his on every newsfeed. Inside, the courtroom air felt different, tighter, like everyone knew something was about to break. The performance begins. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Judge Marks entered, composed as ever. She adjusted her robe and nodded toward the tables. "Let's continue. Mr. Hale, your side may proceed with your next witness." Brandon's lawyer rose with the smug energy of a man who thought he had the winning card up his sleeve. The plaintiff calls Mr. Stephen Cross to the stand. Kayla's eyes flicked toward the door. Stephen, one of Brandon's senior managers, walked in, perfectly groomed, his tie knotted like a noose of loyalty. After swearing in, he began smoothly. "I've worked for Mr. Hale for 5 years. He's the most dedicated and honest businessman I've ever met." Brandon leaned back in satisfaction. The lawyer continued, "And in your experience, has he ever falsified or manipulated company records?" "Absolutely not," Stephen said confidently. "He's meticulous, transparent. He demands excellence." Kayla watched silently, her hands folded tight. She had expected this. Stephen owed his entire career to Brandon, and fear, she knew, could make a man rewrite his own memory. The cross-examination, when it was her turn, Kayla stood. She didn't have a lawyer, but she had the truth, and a small folder of papers she'd kept sealed in an envelope for months. "Mr. Cross," she began quietly, "do you remember the company retreat last April?" He blinked, then nodded. "Yes? You handled the invoices for that trip, correct?" "I helped, yes." She stepped forward, holding up a document. "This is the expense report for that trip, with your name on it. It includes a payment to a luxury resort for $12,000. But the receipts show a total of $5,600. Can you explain the difference?" Stephen hesitated. The courtroom fell silent. "That's probably a clerical error," he said finally. "It happens," Kayla's tone stayed calm. "And yet every error like that seemed to benefit Mr. Hale directly, didn't it?" Brandon's lawyer objected. "Speculation, Your Honor." "Overruled," said Judge Marks. "You may answer." Stephen shifted uncomfortably. I don't know about that. Would you like me to show the emails where you told me to pad the numbers because the boss said so?" Kayla's voice didn't waver. She slid another paper across the table. Brandon's face drained of color. Judge Marks raised a brow. "You have that email, Ms. Brooks?" "Yes, Your Honor. Printed and time-stamped from the company's internal server before my account was deleted." She handed it to the bailiff. The judge read silently for a long moment, then looked up. "Mr. Cross, did you send this email?" Stephen swallowed. I don't recall." "That's not what I asked," the judge said coolly. "Did you send this email?" His silence was answer enough. Brandon's lawyer tried to recover. "Your Honor, we question the authenticity of—" "The metadata is intact," Judge Marks interrupted. "I can see the originating domain. This is legitimate." She leaned back, eyes narrowing. Mr. Cross, perjury is not a small matter. Would you like to reconsider your answer? Stephen looked at Brandon, who gave him a sharp, warning glance, and that's when it happened. A moment so small and yet so monumental it shifted the air. Stephen exhaled. Yes, Your Honor, he said softly. I sent the email. The crumbling wall. Brandon's lawyer froze. Mr. Cross, he hissed. You don't have to, but it was too late. The judge raised her hand. Sit down, counselor, the courtroom murmured, voices rising like a wave. Brandon's jaw clenched tight, his knuckles white against the table. Kayla watched quietly as Stephen continued. I was just following orders, he said, his voice shaking. Mr. Hale told me to make sure the numbers looked right for investors. He said nobody would ever check. Brandon slammed his palm on the table. That's a lie. Mr. Hale, Judge Marks snapped. One more outburst and you'll be held in contempt. He froze, breathing hard. The judge turned back to Stephen. Continue. Stephen's eyes darted between Brandon and Kayla. He made me sign an NDA to keep quiet. Said if I didn't, I'd never work again. Thank you, Judge Marks said, her tone steady. You may step down. As he left the stand, Stephen avoided Brandon's gaze entirely. Brandon's spin, the courtroom buzzed during the short recess. Brandon whispered furiously to his lawyer, his voice low but sharp. We need to destroy her credibility. Bring up her mental health thing. Sir, his lawyer murmured. That's dangerous territory. I don't care, Brandon snapped. Do it. When the recess ended, Brandon's side called Kayla back to the stand. His lawyer put on his best sympathetic tone, the kind that hides daggers. Ms. Brooks, he began, you've testified that you were under immense stress working for my client. Would you say you sometimes overreacted? Kayla frowned. I don't think so. Didn't you seek therapy during your employment? Yes, for anxiety. So you were under emotional distress? I was stressed, yes. Because of the job, he smiled faintly. And isn't it true that you once told your therapist you felt paranoid about people watching you? Kayla's heart raced. That was after I found out my emails were being monitored without my consent. He feigned surprise. You have no proof of that, do you? Kayla hesitated, then slowly reached into her folder again. I do now, she said, pulling out a printed IT log with timestamps. Every outgoing email from my work account was copied to an admin address, Brandon Hale's address. The lawyer froze. The judge looked up sharply. Is that true, Mr. Hale? Brandon stammered. It was standard policy. For all employees? The judge asked. No, just senior staff. Ms. Brooks was an assistant, not senior staff, she said flatly. You were monitoring her communications without disclosure? He didn't answer. Her voice dropped lower. You may want to be very careful with your next words. Mr. Hale. Ego meets evidence. From that moment on, Brandon's mask began to crumble. Each new document Kayla revealed, each small email, each line of code, each internal memo chipped away at his empire of lies. His lawyer's objections came faster, but his confidence came slower. When Kayla described the day she was fired, the courtroom listened in complete silence. He called me into his office, she said. Told me I was no longer a fit. I asked why. He said, you talk too much. Then he made me sign a termination agreement on the spot, threatening to sue if I ever spoke about company finances again. Did you sign it? The judge asked. I did. I didn't think I had a choice. Do you have a copy? Kayla nodded and handed it over. Judge Mark scanned the pages, then looked up, her tone cool but cutting. This agreement is missing a witness signature. That makes it unenforceable, Brandon's lawyer blinked. Excuse me? Unenforceable, she repeated more firmly this time. Which means Ms. Brooks was under no legal obligation to remain silent. Your entire defamation claim rests on an invalid contract. The room erupted in whispers. Brandon sat frozen, his face pale. Your Honor, his lawyer tried. Surely we can— No, she said sharply. Surely you cannot. The public break by the third day of testimony, Brandon was unraveling publicly. Reporters called it the Hale collapse. Clips of his outbursts went viral online. Kayla, meanwhile, spoke calmly each day, not with power, but with quiet truth that pierced deeper than any headline. During cross, Brandon finally snapped. Ms. Brooks, he sneered, standing despite his lawyer's warning, you're just jealous, aren't you? Jealous that I built something you never could. the courtroom gasped. Judge Marks's gavel hit the bench once. Hard. Sit down, Mr. Hale, she commanded. But he didn't. No, Your Honor, he said bitterly. I'm sick of this circus. She's lying. She's always been a liar. Kayla didn't flinch. The judge's voice dropped an octave. Mr. Hale, sit down. Brandon's lawyer tugged at his sleeve, whispering frantically. But Brandon yanked his arm away. She ruined my reputation. He shouted. I'll make sure she pays for this. Silence. The judge's gavel came down again, louder this time. Mr. Hale, you've just crossed a line. This court will recess, and when we return, we will discuss your contempt charge. He froze, realizing too late what he'd just done. The private warning. After clearing the courtroom, Judge Marks remained seated. Brandon's lawyer approached, pale and sweating. Your Honor, my client has a problem distinguishing arrogance from authority, she interrupted, and I will not allow that in my courtroom. She turned her gaze directly to Brandon. You may think your money grants you control, but in here, control belongs to the law. Do you understand me? Brandon nodded stiffly. Good, she said. Then act like it. As he left, cameras flashed again in the hallway. This time, though, his expression wasn't confident. It was strained, defensive, the look of a man who could feel his empire shaking beneath him. Kayla walked past quietly, head high, eyes forward. The reporters swarmed her too, but she didn't stop to speak. She didn't need to. The truth was finally speaking for her. The third morning dawned gray and heavy, as if the sky itself sensed what was coming. The courthouse, usually a blur of chatter and camera flashes, felt quieter today. The air charged with that uneasy calm before a storm breaks. Inside, Judge Marks sat already at her bench, reviewing notes in silence. The bailiff stood ready, the reporters whispered. Even the usual hum of the ceiling vents seemed to hush. Everyone could feel it. Today was Judgment Day. Brandon Hale entered with less swagger than usual. The sunglasses were gone, the arrogance thinned. His designer suit still fit perfectly, but something about the way he wore it had changed. It hung looser, like the confidence had drained out of the man who once strutted in like a king. Kayla Brooks, by contrast, looked steady. She wore the same outfit as before, hair pinned neatly, a quiet strength about her. She didn't need flash. She had truth. And truth, as everyone was about to witness, doesn't need to shout to be heard. Opening the final day court is now in session, the bailiff announced. Judge Marks looked over the rim of her glasses. Today we will hear final arguments. After that, I will issue my ruling. Brandon's lawyer stood first. His voice was tight, professional but nervous. Your Honor, we maintain that Ms. Brooks' online statements caused measurable harm to Mr. Hale's reputation and business. While she may believe her claims to be true, her actions were reckless and vindictive. She spread accusations without proper legal channels, and my client's company suffered substantial financial loss as a result. Judge Marks nodded slightly, expression unreadable. Thank you, Counselor. Ms. Brooks, your closing statement. Kayla stood, her papers trembling slightly in her hands. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. I never wanted to be here, she began softly. I didn't post what I did to hurt anyone. I did it because I couldn't live with the lies anymore. Mr. Hale built his success on people like me, people who worked hard and stayed silent. When I realized what was happening, I spoke up. And for that, I lost everything. But I'd do it again. Because if the truth cost me everything, then maybe it's still worth the price. The courtroom was silent. Not a cough, not a whisper. Brandon rolled his eyes. But there was no laughter behind it now. Just fatigue. The turning point, Mr. Hale, the judge said suddenly. Before I make my ruling, I have one question. He straightened. Yes, Your Honor. Throughout this case, you've claimed to value integrity and transparency. But your financial records, your employee testimonies, and your own outbursts suggest otherwise. So I'd like to know, under oath, do you still believe Ms. Brooks lied about you? He hesitated. It was the first time she'd asked him directly. The cameras zoomed in. He smirked faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. Yes, Your Honor, she lied. She's always lied. Then explain this. Judge Marks lifted a small folder from her bench and opened it. These are bank statements subpoenaed from your business accounts yesterday afternoon. They confirm that the clerical errors in question, including those Ms. Brooks testified about, transferred directly into an offshore holding under your name. Care to elaborate? Brandon blinked. That's impossible. It's not impossible, she interrupted. It's documented. He froze. His lawyer buried his face in his hands. The judge's voice dropped lower, calm but lethal. You've spent this entire trial trying to prove you were the victim. But the evidence shows you've been manipulating both your employees and your finances for years. You didn't come to this court seeking justice. You came seeking control. The fall of the mask. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Brandon's face went crimson. Your Honor, he sputtered. That's not... I didn't know about any of that. Someone else must have... Enough, she said sharply. Do not insult this court with excuses. You're under oath and the documents speak louder than your words, he tried again. But, Mr. Hale? She barked, her voice like thunder now. Sit down! The sound of her gavel cracked through the room. Brandon sat, shaking with silent fury. Kayla stared at him, not with triumph, but with quiet disbelief. For the first time, she saw the man behind the mask, small, frightened, and suddenly very human. Judge Marks continued. This court has seen arrogance before. We've seen wealth weaponized. But what we've seen here today, the deliberate abuse of power, the intimidation of employees, the manipulation of truth, that is something I will not tolerate. Brandon's lawyer tried once more. Your Honor, if I may... You may not, she said. You had your chance. The ruling Judge Marks leaned forward slightly, hands folded on the bench. Her voice softened, but only slightly. Ms. Brooks, she began, your actions in speaking out were legally protected. Your statements were supported by evidence, verified under oath, and backed by documentation now confirmed by subpoena. Therefore, your words do not constitute defamation. Kayla's breath caught. Mr. Hale, the judge turned toward him, your lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice. Additionally, given the findings of financial misconduct revealed during this trial, I am referring this case to the district attorney's office for further investigation. The color drained from Brandon's face. What does that mean? It means, the judge said coldly, that your lies didn't just fail here. They may cost you far more outside this courtroom. The audience erupted in whispers. Cameras clicked like gunfire. Brandon's lawyer whispered something panicked into his ear, but the businessman wasn't listening anymore. He was staring straight ahead, jaw slack, as if the floor beneath him had just disappeared. The moment of reckoning, Judge Marks wasn't done. One more thing, she said. Mr. Hale, your behavior toward this court, your contempt, your public comments, and your disregard for basic decency have consequences. I am imposing a fine of $10,000 for contempt of court. Brandon's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Bailiff, the judge added calmly, escort Mr. Hale from the courtroom until he regains his composure. The bailiff stepped forward. Brandon stood up abruptly, but his knees seemed weak. For the first time, he didn't look like a man in control. He looked like a man unraveling. As he passed Kayla, he muttered under his breath, "You'll regret this." Judge Marks' voice cut across the room like a blade. Mr. Hale, he froze mid-step. She leaned forward slightly. That attitude is exactly why you're standing where you are now. You don't understand that respect is not demanded. It's earned. Then, after a pause, she added quietly, and right now, you've earned none. The room went silent again. Brandon was led out the side door, shoulders slumped, the weight of his empire collapsing behind him. The quiet. After the storm, for a long moment, no one moved. The sound of the door closing behind him lingered like the final note of a symphony. Then the judge turned to Kayla. Ms. Brooks, she said, you've endured something few people would have the courage to face. You've stood against someone more powerful, more connected, and more ruthless, and you've done it with grace. I hope today restores your faith, even just a little, in what justice can be. Kayla's voice trembled. Thank you, Your Honor. Judge Marks nodded once. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down one final time. Outside the courtroom, as Kayla stepped outside, the midday light felt almost unreal. Reporters swarmed instantly, questions firing from every direction. How do you feel? Do you plan to press charges? Did you expect to win? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She just smiled faintly, a smile of quiet victory, not triumph. Her friend, who'd been watching from the gallery, approached her. You did it, they whispered. Kayla shook her head gently. No, the truth did. In the distance, Brandon was being rushed into a black SUV, reporters chasing after him like vultures after a carcass. His once polished hair was disheveled, his face drawn and pale. Cameras caught every second. The fall of the man who thought he couldn't be touched. The judge's reflection, back inside, Judge Mark sat alone at her bench. The courtroom was empty now, save for the quiet hum of the lights and the faint smell of paper and wood polish. She closed the file slowly, her expression thoughtful. She had seen 1,000 cases, 1,000 faces, but some stayed with her. Not because they were dramatic, but because they revealed something fundamental, how far people would go to protect a lie, and how much strength it took to defend the truth. She looked up briefly toward the empty witness stand and sighed. Arrogance always falls, she murmured to herself. Sometimes it just needs a push. Then she turned off the light and left the bench, her black robe sweeping behind her, a quiet silhouette of justice walking out into the afternoon sun. The courtroom had emptied hours ago, but echoes of it still lingered. In the marble floors, in the cameras outside, in the hushed conversations of those who'd watched a man with everything lose it all in a single ruling. For Brandon Hale, that day became the dividing line of his life, before the verdict and after the verdict. Before he was a name that filled boardrooms and headlines. After he was a cautionary tale whispered in corporate corridors, proof that arrogance, once cracked, never glues back the same way. The fall of a giant. The following morning, news anchors dissected the trial like vultures over a carcass. Hale empire crumbles amid scandal. Judge exposes CEO's web of lies. The employee who stood up and won. Every outlet ran the footage. The gavel slam, the frozen shock on Brandon's face, the quiet poise of Kayla as the ruling landed. Within 24 hours, his company's board of directors announced an emergency meeting. Within 72, they'd voted to suspend him indefinitely. And within a week, Brandon's name had vanished from the company website entirely. He tried to fight it. Of course he did. He called his lawyer, his PR team, his old media contacts. But none of them answered with the same enthusiasm they once did. Some didn't answer at all. The empire he'd built on charm, intimidation, an image collapsed faster than anyone imagined, not because of the judgment itself, but because of what it revealed, that Brandon Hale's power had always been borrowed, never earned. The isolation. He sat alone in his penthouse overlooking the city, the same skyline he'd once pointed to as proof of his greatness. Now it just felt like a jury of glass towers, silently watching his decline. Stacks of unopened mail piled on the kitchen island, termination letters, court notices, bank alerts. He scrolled his phone for hours some nights, searching for someone, anyone, who still wanted to be associated with him. But influence, he was learning, had an expiration date. And arrogance had made sure his ran out early. The only message that caught his eye came from an old mentor. Power shows who you are. Losing it shows who you've become. He didn't reply. He poured another drink instead, the only companion that didn't walk out on him. Kayla's quiet victory across town. Life for Kayla Brooks was still far from glamorous, but it was hers. She'd moved into a modest new apartment with pale blue curtains and a rescued cat she named Justice. A quiet little reminder of what she'd earned. She still worked part-time at a community nonprofit, helping others who'd faced workplace retaliation. The pay was low, but the purpose was high. Some nights she'd replay that final courtroom moment in her head. The gavel's echo, the rush of disbelief, the release of years of fear. She didn't feel vengeful. She didn't even feel proud. Mostly she felt peaceful. It wasn't about winning. It was about being heard. A week later, she received a small envelope in the mail. Inside was a handwritten note. Short, simple, but powerful. Ms. Brooks, I've seen hundreds of cases, but few remind me why this job matters. Thank you for standing tall. You restored more than your own dignity. You restored faith. Judge Evelyn Marks, Kayla held the note for a long time. Then she placed it in a small wooden frame on her shelf. Some victories didn't need trophies. Some only needed truth. The media storm, meanwhile, the story refused to die. Late-night hosts joked about Brandon Hale's meltdown. Memes flooded social media, one showing the moment he stood red-faced before the judge, captioned, "When money can't buy mercy." But not all coverage was cruel. Some journalists framed it differently, as a turning point, a cultural mirror. The Kayla Brooks effect, one headline read. Standing up in a system built to silence. For the first time in her life, Kayla wasn't invisible. She was being called brave, honest, a voice for workers. But she didn't seek the spotlight. When asked for interviews, she declined most of them. The truth had already been spoken. She didn't need to repeat it. Still, her story traveled farther than she imagined. Young women sent messages saying her courage inspired them to speak out. Former employees of Brandon's company reached out privately, sharing similar experiences. A small movement began to take shape, one built not on anger, but accountability. And while Brandon hid behind locked doors, Kayla was helping others open theirs. The reckoning. 2 months later, the district attorney's office filed charges against Brandon Hale for fraud and falsification of business records. When the news broke, he barely reacted. He just sat at his kitchen table staring at the headline glowing on his phone screen. The words felt unreal, like they belonged to someone else. But they didn't. They belonged to him, the man who once believed he could control everything and everyone. The DA's statement was brief. Evidence provided during civil proceedings revealed substantial misconduct requiring further investigation. No one, regardless of status or wealth, is above accountability. That night, Brandon stood on his balcony, city lights flickering below like tiny witnesses. He thought of all the people he'd dismissed, employees, friends, even family. Somewhere along the way, he'd mistaken fear for respect, compliance for loyalty, and now, there was no one left to fear him. He poured another drink, staring at his reflection in the glass window. For the first time, he didn't see power. He saw a man who'd been his own undoing. The judge's lesson months later, Judge Evelyn Marks spoke at a law symposium about integrity in the justice system. The crowd, young attorneys, students, and civic leaders, listened as she told a story without names. Only principles. There's a kind of arrogance that money breeds, she said, her silver hair glinting under the lights. It convinces people they can buy their version of the truth. But justice doesn't take bids. It only listens. And when it speaks, it doesn't whisper. It strikes. Her closing words echoed through the hall. The courtroom isn't where power lives. It's where power is tested. Outside, one young woman in the audience wiped her eyes. She'd been following the case for months, working as a paralegal, dreaming of becoming a judge herself someday. That night, she decided she would. Sometimes justice doesn't just punish, it inspires. The redemption won late afternoon. Months later, as autumn light painted the city gold, Kayla was walking home from work when she saw a familiar figure sitting on a park bench, alone, slouched, staring at the pavement. Brandon Hale. He looked smaller now, like the sharp edges had been sanded down by time and consequence. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a plain jacket. His hair was longer, his eyes tired. He didn't notice her until she stopped in front of him. "Kayla," he said quietly, almost in disbelief. "Didn't expect to see you," she nodded, cautious but calm. "I didn't expect to see you here either." He looked down, exhaling slowly. "I'm not going to ask for forgiveness." "I know that's not mine to ask for," she didn't reply. He continued, "I lost everything. The company, the house, the people who pretended to care. Turns out, none of it was real." Kayla studied him. For once, there was no ego, no performance, just a man facing the rubble of his own choices. "Maybe now you get to build something that is real," she said quietly. He looked up, eyes tired but genuine. "Maybe." They stood there in silence for a moment, not friends, not enemies. Just two people connected by truth, separated by the choices that brought them here. When she walked away, he didn't call after her. He just sat, watching the leaves fall, realizing that humility wasn't something you could buy. It was something you earned, usually the hard way. Epilogue, the balance of truth time passed. The noise faded. The headlines moved on, but the story of Kayla Brooks and Brandon Hale lived longer than the cameras that covered it. It became a case study in universities, a discussion in ethics seminars, a parable whispered in workplaces, not because it was sensational, but because it was real. A woman with nothing stood up to a man who thought he had everything. And in the end, truth, quiet, patient, and unbending, won. Kayla's cat purred softly as she typed at her kitchen table, finishing a draft for an article titled, "The Price of Silence: Why Speaking Up Still Matters." She paused, glancing at the framed note from Judge Marks. "You restored faith?" A faint smile curved her lips. She hit save, then turned off the lamp. Outside her window, the city shimmered, alive, imperfect, and honest.